Welcome to Uncomfortable Conversations about Culture and Christianity. Today, I am joined by Dr. Rana, who is a biochemist, and we are going to have a fun conversation about all things that I don't even understand. And so hopefully take the journey with me to understanding so many different things. One of the things that's interesting that I think is a topic that's coming up more and more with AI and all the technology is just transhumanism. Mm-hmm. That sounds cool and sounds like it's like a movie that's been made before, but can you just explain to people like me in layman's term what that is and maybe what the research goes behind it and just how do I understand it?
Sure. Well, a lot of people I find are unfamiliar with the term transhumanism. So if you're unfamiliar with that term, or people watching this podcast are unfamiliar, you're a pretty large club. But people are familiar with the concepts because if you watch anything involving science fiction, because it's essentially the idea that we have a moral obligation, and usually people that are transhumanists make a very emphatic statement that we have a moral obligation to use science and technology to modify our biology, to modify our biological makeup as human beings with the goal of making us stronger, more intelligent, more psychologically well adapted. They argue that, look, human beings have flaws, we have limitations, and these flaws and limitations cause suffering. So if we can step in and modify ourselves in such a way that we can mitigate that pain and suffering, that would be a really good thing. And some people who advocate for transhumanism even argue that we really ought to be taking control of the evolutionary process and evolving ourselves into post-human species.
Okay. That
would be so different from us today that we wouldn't recognize them as human beings anymore, that they would be something other than human beings. That's a more extreme version, but that's, in a sense, the trajectory that transhumanism is on.
My mind goes to like Avatar or, movies like that when you talk about that.
Yes.
The listeners of this podcast will very much know that I'm a very flawed person and miss things sometimes. And I just jumped right in. I didn't even have you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about who you are and what you do. So we'll reverse real quick and have you do that after you already answered the first question.
Yeah. Well, I'm a biochemist by training, and I work for an organization called Reasons to Believe. And our organization exists to open people to the gospel by revealing God in science. And so what we do at Reasons to Believe is use the latest advances in science, or at least that's where we give the strongest emphasis, to really answer people's questions about how science and faith fit together with an eye towards helping them overcome objections that they might have to the Christianity that they perceive come from science. And it's very powerful to see how the latest discoveries in science provide evidence for God's existence and the reliability of Scripture. So I've been with Reasons to Believe for 25 years. The organization was founded almost 40 years ago by Dr. Hugh Ross and his wife, Kathy. And so I've had the privilege of being part of that team for a quarter of a century.
Wow, that's so cool. So was Christian faith and the worldview always a part of your story, or how did that come to be?
No, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. By the time I was in college, I would have called myself an agnostic, didn't know if God existed, could have cared less. I was very interested in becoming a biochemist. And as I took courses in chemistry, and particularly courses in biology, I was presented with this idea that evolutionary mechanisms could explain everything in biology. And I, like many people, reasoned, look, if evolution can explain it all, what role is there for a creator? And that made me very comfortable as an agnostic. When I went to graduate school to really pursue biochemistry in depth, that's where I was confronted with the incredible designs of biochemical systems. They looked like they were the work of a mind. And I also came to appreciate that evolutionary processes can't explain how the very first cells would have emerged on Earth, how biochemical systems would have come into being. And so that meant to me there had to be a creator. And then the question was, well, who is that creator? And how do I relate to that creator? And it was through a pastor's challenge to read the Bible that I picked up a copy of the scriptures and began reading through the Gospel of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount, and that was deeply impactful to me and really led to me to recognize my sin, but also the work of Christ on the cross as a way to not only have my sins forgiven, but to be reconciled to the Creator. And that to me is mind-blowing as a biochemist, that the Creator whose fingerprints I see in the inner workings of the cell is a Creator that I can know in an intimate and personal way. That to me is just absolutely mind-boggling.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful as we go into the rest of the conversation and people take this journey with us, that I think sometimes we assume, especially I was raised in a Christian household. I'm a pastor. Like, of course, I'm going to say everything like, hey, this is all about Scripture. And then it's easy to walk back from Scripture and say, I need to overlay that onto science. But you came from the other perspective where science was everything. You were studying that, and then you found your way, to Jesus and that personal relationship. And so for those listening, I think that's important. It's not just, hey, this Christian guy that's coming here just to pound the hatchet, and he was raised that way and trying to convince you, but he was convinced through deep study and intellect of that. And so I think a lot of people find that as a hang up. Yeah. So thanks for sharing that part of your story. So as Christians, as we approach technology and we're looking at transhumanism, there's a couple terms, restoration and enhancement, that I came across through some internet study. Can you explain what those are and then what distinctions are between those two?
Yeah. And, this idea of transhumanism, let me preface that by saying, has always been considered a fringe idea in the academy. And in the last decade or so, it's moved from being kind of a marginal idea to being in the mainstream with people that are interested in questions involving technology, with philosophers who are looking at the philosophy of technology. It's now become a credible idea, and it's taken over the academy. It's infiltrating our culture at large, where the ideas of science fiction are now literally becoming reality before our eyes. And the technologies that primarily legitimize transhumanism are gene editing, where we can go in and modify the genetic makeup of organisms, including human beings. That means that we could treat genetic disorders, but we could also use the technology to enhance human beings genetically beyond our natural biological limits. Another area that's very exciting are brain-computer interfaces, where we can literally implant electronic devices into different regions of the brain and extract user intent from the electrical activity in the brain, allowing them to control computer hardware and software. This is going to revolutionize how we treat people that are amputees, because with these brain-computer interfaces, they can learn to control robotic prosthetic limbs. People that are quadriplegic and paraplegic can learn to control exoskeletons with these brain-computer interfaces. Or people that are locked in that can't communicate because of a brain injury, let's say, are now going to be able to communicate. So these are really exciting, applications that are going to transform medicine. And that's where the restoration aspect of the technology comes into being. But as I mentioned with gene editing, if you can correct a genetic defect, why couldn't you modify the genome of a person so that they now can become more intelligent or physically stronger, or can overcome psychological limitations, right? Or if you can use a brain-computer interface to allow someone to control a robotic prosthetic limb, why couldn't you use it to make them, have physical strength beyond our natural biological limits?
Yeah.
So that's where the enhancement aspect comes in. And the idea of the enhancements is really the stepping stone to the transhumanist vision, where, again, the goal is to completely modify human beings beyond our current state to create post-humans.
Where does what is it called? The Neuralink? Is that what Elon Musk is doing a lot of research? So where does that fall into that category?
It exactly does. He's actually working on developing brain-computer interfaces. And from everything I understand, and I'm generally familiar with the technology, what he has done at Neuralink is considered to be the state of the art, maybe even beyond the state of the art. Work in brain-computer interface technology is one of the hottest areas in bioengineering. there are people all over the world working on this problem and are making some incredible advances. And it's, quintessential Elon Musk who will steps into this area with his company Neuralink and takes it beyond the state of the art. So he's done some incredible things, and his technology is now in small scale clinical testing. There's at least 2 people I know that have received the Neuralink brain implant, and the reports are really very encouraging and very exciting. He's also now developing these glasses that could help people that are blind be able to see, right? Wow. So, this is still in development, but that's essentially what Neuralink is all about. So this brain-computer interface stuff isn't just buried in the biomedical literature. It's actually, very much in the forefront thanks to Elon Musk and his larger-than-life personality. And it's very interesting because Elon Musk's motivation for doing this isn't just simply humanitarian, and that's a strong motivation. But he also sees these brain-computer interfaces as the next generation in the human technology interface, right? So everything now is increasingly becoming voice-activated, right? Where we speak, and that's how we interface with the technology around us. Well, he's thinking, well, if we commercialize brain-computer interfaces, then people just think, and the technology does what they want. So that's now where you're going from restoration, treating somebody who is locked in, to an enhancement. And in a sense, Elon Musk is a transhumanist. I don't think he is enthusiastically embracing transhumanism, but he's a reluctant transhumanist. But his ultimate vision for Neuralink is the human survival. He sees it as an existential need because his concern is that as AI technology becomes more and more powerful, that it really poses a threat to humanity. He's an AI naysayer. He is afraid that either AI is going to drive us to extinction or is going to subjugate us. And his argument is that unless we develop these brain-computer interfaces and are capable of interfacing ourselves to computer systems to augment our intelligence and the brain's computational power and capacity to store memory, we're never going to be able to compete with the AI technology we're creating. And if we don't, he sees this as an imperative. But what he's advocating for is, in effect, transhumanism, that we would create human machines, hybrids, cyborgs, right? Yeah. That would be the only way that we could survive as a human species.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And it seems like it's moved, like you said, in the last 10 years, but it just moved so quickly over those last 10 years.
Well, this is the problem, is that this technology is moving so quickly that it's impossible, even as someone who has devoted themselves to studying this, you can't keep up with the advances. Even through deliberate, focused study of it, it's happening so rapidly. There's no time for anybody to pause and even ask questions about, should we be developing this technology? If so, how should we use it? What are the safeguards that need to be put in place? Ethicists don't even have time to process an advance in the technology before the next generation and the next generation and the next generation comes down the pike. We're outpacing our ability to think about this in a detailed, critical way.
Yeah.
That's what is, for me, concerning, is the pace of the developments.
Yeah, to even be able to regulate it or put any of those kinds of things that we've typically done on things as a government or just safeguards. It's fascinating. I recently read a book called Anxious Generation, and he was talking about just social media and how fast we've moved in technology and getting into kids' hands, and how you can see the correlations between anxiety and depression and suicide rates and all those things, because we've been outpacing, like you said, the ability to really regulate that kind of stuff. And so it's fascinating. So for me, I'm not a big science fiction type of person. I enjoy it, but I really started thinking a lot more about this kind of stuff about 5 years ago when my wife and I, our youngest daughter, was born deaf, and that was new. It was no one in our family. Actually, she wasn't born deaf. She was born past her hearing screenings, and then at 6 months, when she went and got tubes, we found out she got a virus, and she went deaf. And so it was a whole new world for us. We're like, this is a whole new culture. We don't know ASL. We're going to audiologists, learning all these things, and they presented us, with an option of cochlear implants, which is something I had never heard. I know more about the ear than I ever thought I would at this point. Which essentially is, giving her the ability to have access to sound, and 30, 40 years ago, especially in the United States, it was science fiction, really. Like, that's somebody who's deaf and no longer are the, follicles in their hair and their cochlea standing and electrodes able to, they're not able to hear. Now they're able to. And so we wrestled through, okay, what does this look like in our family of origin, our family culture? We also met some friends here in the deaf community that were really adamant that that's not the best decision, because one, you're going to have potential to erase deaf culture, because now a new family who would be a part of deaf community and culture, learning ASL, learning how to build relationships, is slowly not going to be a part of it. That's a big fear. And many people have done that have gotten cochlear implants, they're still deaf technically, but have rejected in a lot of ways deaf culture, learning sign and all those things, because now they have access to sound. So anyway, it was a whole journey that my wife and I have been on. And so it's made me more curious about how do we start to we had to pray through it and look at what are the ethical considerations of all these kinds of things. And it was a difficult journey. And as we're going through that, I'm like, I wish there were more resources. I wish I could find more and more conversations about people having these types of conversations, so I can think critically and theologically and all of that about it. And so that's just one example, but in my own personal life of that, would you, just for clarity, would that be an enhancement or a restoration?
I would see it as a restoration.
Okay.
More so than an enhancement, but it's very easy to see how something like that could bleed into an enhancement. So for example, if you can give somebody who is deaf a cochlear implant, why would you have to limit the range of sound to what human beings normally hear? Why not expand that range, right? Other animals are able to hear at higher and lower frequencies than we can hear. So why not give those people with cochlear implants that added ability? So it's very easy to see where restoration can bleed into enhancement. And there might be very good reasons why you would want to do that. It might actually serve humanity in some way, right? Yeah. And so the line between restoration and enhancement can be really pretty blurry. And you could justify easing or turning a restoration into an enhancement very easily. But another place where you see this line that's quite blurry is with regard to genetic modifications of human beings, the gene editing using CRISPR technology. And there was a Chinese scientist who genetically engineered embryos to be resistant to HIV. And there's a particular receptor protein that the HIV virus binds to, that receptor protein resides on the surface of certain cells. And it turns out that people that are naturally resistant to HIV have a mutation in that particular receptor protein, and it doesn't seem to have any other biomedical consequence. So his idea was, let's just use CRISPR gene editing in embryos and disable that particular gene. Now you have embryos that could, in principle, develop into a human being that would not be able to be infected by HIV.
Wow.
Okay, so question is, to you, is that a medical restoration because you are helping somebody gain immunity against a very pernicious virus, or is it actually an enhancement? I think about this all the time, and I don't know the answer to this.
Yeah.
Right? Where is the line between a restoration or a bona fide medical treatment, and where's the line between an enhancement? right? So it's really quite blurry.
Yeah.
Now, there's some instances where it's very clear, this is restoration, this is an enhancement, but there's a lot of examples where that line is really uncertain.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think for Christians especially, the phrase maybe that comes up a lot of times is this idea of playing God, right? Like one of the 10 commandments, do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And we have a deep respect for God as creator and the created order that he created things in. And so I think that's a big part of, and that whole idea, that can go from birth control on one end of, somebody, playing God in quote, air quotes, to some of these things where you're making enhancements to genes, which are doing these things. And so I think that's really where a lot of Christians start to feel uneasy about where am I overstepping my boundaries and how am I using these things in a way that, okay, I believe that God gave us the ability to be creative and this technology. I mean, we look at just the advancements. And I remember as a kid, you met somebody that had any form of cancer. It was a death sentence. That was, 30 years ago. Breast cancer, and I know so many breast cancer survivors and so many other cancer survivors, and so much of that is due to biochemistry and a lot of the things that we've learned in that kind of way. And so it seems like we want both ends of the spectrum, but then are kind of uneasy. So how do you address, as we're thinking through a theological lens, where do we get into that gray area of, man, we're starting to go from people made in God's image to making people in our own preferred image, I guess.
Yeah. That is the $64 million question that you're asking, right? That, and I don't know of anybody at this point that can give a singular answer to that question. It really means that as a Christian community, we have to come together with the best scholarship and really wrestle collectively with these questions. I think the best place to start is with the human origins accounts that we see and the idea that human beings are made in God's image, and really think through, what does that mean to be made in God's image, right? And, because we bear God's image, we have certain responsibilities. We are to multiply and fill the earth, to subdue the earth, to rule over the earth, to be stewards of the planet. And really embedded in those ideas are two concepts. We need to do what we can to promote human flourishing, and because that honors the image of God in us and in other people. We also need to be caretakers of the planet. But in many respects, because of the nature of those responsibilities we've been given that flow out of the fact that we image God, when somebody says, well, should we play God? My response is always, we have no choice to play God because of the fact that we bear God's image. The real question is, are we trying to take God's place, right? And do we have the wisdom to pursue technologies that are so powerful that if we misuse them, it could be devastating? And we also recognize that as human beings, we're sinful, and we can take even the best intended technology and pervert it for horrible purposes. So those concepts are, in a sense, all in play that we have to wrestle with and engage, right? And so, that's in my mind, the place to start is really with the image of God, and work through how do we apply that and the implications of that to these kinds of questions.
Yeah. And I think we often want to go to that macro level about how and I loved how you said, are we trying to take the place of God? Because on a micro level, that's what sin is, right? Like all of us daily, with almost every decision we're making, we're saying either I'm on the throne or God's on the throne. Either I'm going to take God's place on the throne of my heart, or I'm going to let God take that rightful place. And so not even on macro level, but it's in micro decisions that we're making where we're allowing ourselves, and maybe we're like, oh, that's bad, and we're keeping that at a distance. But I think it forces Christians to ask that question about ourselves and our own souls in my life, in every decision I'm making, not just in these maybe feels like sci-fi places, but in every decision I'm making, am I actually letting God sit on his throne, or am I trying to be the one that takes that place? And so I think that's good, and I think it forces even the person that's maybe not as interested in all of this type of stuff, or kind of just wants to shove it to the side. It forces us to also be introspective about it as believers as well.
Yeah. Well, and I would really encourage people not to shove this idea aside. It's very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. It can be frightening at times to think about this. But this idea of transhumanism in some version, shape, or form is literally going to influence the way the world looks in the next couple of decades. It is going to be an idea of very critical prominence. And if, as Christians, if we're not thinking about it now and developing expertise and really developing a robust theological response that's shaped ultimately by our faith as Christians and really what the gospel entails, the heart of the gospel, we are going to have no influence over how this technology is developed and used. On the other hand, if we're willing to roll up our sleeves and do the hard work and engage with credibility, I think we're going to be able to have a big influence on what the world looks like, and employ kingdom of God principles to help direct where this technology goes. Because it's critical to keep in mind, as you can attest to with respect to your daughter, enormous amount of good can come from this technology. Yeah. We don't want to be Luddites when it comes to, thinking about this technology being deployed, because there's so many lives that could be transformed. And through that, so many people that would be allowed to flourish as image bearers. On the other hand, the technology can be used for purposes that really, I think, not only don't honor God, but could really be devastating to humanity. One of the things that if I'm going to be critical of transhumanists, the biggest criticism would be they're incredibly naive. They walk around as if this technology is only going to be used for good purposes, that there's not going to be unintended consequences. Person after person after person that advocates that transhumanist vision is extremely naive. This is where Christians can come into the picture and present the reality of who we are as human beings and how that reality could impact how this technology is used.
Yeah, and why morality matters and all those things. And it seems like, these are new ideas, but I think of how many people have pacemakers and insulin pumps and so many of these things that seem so easy and so like you just go get a pacemaker, quick outpatient surgery. These days it used to be you're in the hospital for a long time, and so how do you think maybe those that are opposed to it in a large scale can think through it, and like what's the transition been like? What are some of the other positives? Those are just a couple I think of where technology, we don't even think about it, but like decades ago it was science fiction, and now we're benefiting as a whole, in society from it. Yeah,
well, and we've already talked a little bit about, brain-computer interfaces, but one area where there's some remarkable advances that are happening is in gene editing technology, where we could go in using CRISPR gene editing. It's a very powerful technique that's very relatively easy to use, relatively inexpensive. But using a CRISPR gene editing in a clinical study, people with sickle cell anemia were cured.
Wow.
So about 75% of the participants in this clinical study were cured of sickle cell anemia because of CRISPR gene editing. And there's a whole host of other blood diseases that are genetic in nature that probably are going to fall, by the wayside as well. This is, again, something that people that suffered from sickle cell anemia never even thought was possible because there weren't even really very effective therapies to manage the disease.
Yeah.
And so that's just an example of the incredible good that can come from this technology. There's about 10,000 genetic disorders that involve mutations to a single point or a single region of the human genome. And many of these are rare genetic disorders where we don't understand them very well, where there's no therapies or treatments whatsoever. The amount of pain and suffering that we could mitigate with CRISPR gene editing technology, which is ideally suited for treating genetic disorders where there's a single mutation.
Wow.
Is remarkable. So this is going to revolutionize medicine. We don't want to be, opposed to this, right? Because, I was part of a panel a number of years ago where we were exploring these kind of questions. And one of the people on the panel was a philosopher by the name of Ben Mitchell, Christian philosopher, very prominent, well-respected philosopher. And his point was anything that this technology does to enable the full expression of the image of God is a legitimate use of it. So when you think of somebody that suffers from sickle cell anemia and they're in pain, their life is cut short, their talents are going to be lost prematurely, their talents may not ever be fully expressed, for them to be able to receive this kind of treatment and now suddenly be able to fully express themselves and fully engage the world manifesting the image of God, that's something that brings glory to God. That's something, in my view, that is fully consistent with the command that God gave to Adam and Eve and their descendants, about really promoting human flourishing. This is an incredible way that we can love our neighbor, right? Yeah. Is by providing that kind of treatment. But then we also need to be, again, aware of the clarion call of this could also be used now to enhance people. And is that something we really want to do, right?
Yeah, and I think that's all super fascinating. One of the conversations I've had from people in a theological sense is like we think of like a Job, or we think of people that suffering has been their pathway to really identifying more with Christ. And so had they been healed or had, something happened, then they're like, I don't know that I would have been able to know and identify with and understand Christ at the same level. And onlookers as well, strength faith is strengthened by looking at somebody suffering well in this. And so do you have any fear that if we get to a point where we try to eliminate as much of the suffering as possible in the human experience, that would also push us from understanding that side of the suffering servant of a Christ who came and, experienced suffering in a very real way, ultimately in his death. So how do you think through that in a theological lens?
Yeah, that is an incredibly good question that, and I'm going to offer a response that isn't going to feel like a satisfying response. Yeah. But in some respects, as Christians, at least this is the way I think about it, is our response to the suffering of others is paradoxical in some respects. Because on one hand, we want to do what we can to mitigate the pain and suffering of other people, right? Yeah. But then on the other hand, we want to also at the same time communicate to them a robust theology of suffering, which is in a sense, the point that you're making, is that suffering is very much a part of our lives as human beings. It's very much part of how God shapes our character. But I don't want to, because of that, go out and not express compassion and help to someone who's suffering, right? But on the other hand, when I'm unable to fully help them mitigate that suffering in a physical sense, that it's very important that we're supporting them, through prayer, through, our presence, but also that we're instructing them in terms of there is a purpose oftentimes that God will have for suffering. The same thing is true for us. When we get hurt, we try to mitigate our own pain and suffering, right? Because we recognize that not only is it not comfortable, but it keeps us from doing the things that we feel like God is calling us to. But then again, we also need to understand in our own lives that the pain and suffering we're experiencing isn't without purpose, isn't without meaning. It can be a good thing. So that's, in a sense, that paradox. So it's really, almost a case-by-case basis where the role that suffering plays in each person's journey is unique to that person, right?
Yeah. And I understand how for some people maybe that's not a satisfactory answer, but we, all the time on this podcast, like we wrestle through. There's paradox, there's nuance to every single conversation, and I think a lot of times people want somebody to just tell you how to think or tell you how it's going to be, because we don't actually have to wrestle through the mess and the chaos and the reality that I don't know. There's something humbling about I don't know, and I'm trusting that there's a God that's here, that's going to give me wisdom when I ask for it, but also I'm not going to get it all on this side of earth. Last kind of space I want to ask questions, because we got some Q&A about this. I had the Q&As. I got all the text messages over the last few days, which is fascinating. The things people ask is, I think one of the areas that Christians really have to wrestle through, and it's been hijacked politically, but I'm not even trying to go into a political sense, is just life, the origin of life. IVF kind of falls into those kinds of things. And so knowing what we know, about even life in the womb, way more than we ever knew, especially when scripture was written and all of those kinds of things, how do we as Christians faithfully just wrestle through, and what are some considerations that we should have through science as we wrestle through these things, as we get more information, as we just know more? How do we better, more faithfully, in an orthodox way, wrestle through all of these conversations that are out there?
Yeah. Again, a very important question that you're asking that has implications for some of the technology we're talking about with respect to transhumanism, because when it comes, for example, to gene editing, you can deliver the gene editing package to different tissues, and that will temporarily mitigate the symptoms of a genetic disorder. You're not going to fully cure somebody unless you can go in and alter the genome of every cell in the body. And the only way to do that is at the stage of embryos, which means you're going to have to do gene editing on embryos that you would create through in vitro fertilization. If somebody wants to have kids and they know that each of them is a carrier for a particular set of genetic disorders, they may want to have embryos created through in vitro fertilization, screen those embryos, identify the ones that display that genetic disease, and then do gene editing on them, which means you then are going to most likely have to discard other embryos that you've created.
Yeah.
So you really get into this arena that is, for someone who holds to a pro-life position, is completely unacceptable. But in many respects, even with in vitro fertilization, and I want to be very careful as I say this and not display a lack of compassion, the more I have thought about in vitro fertilization over the years, the less in favor of it I actually am.
Okay.
And it's not because so much the inherent nature of what you're doing with in vitro fertilization. It's very much at one level pro-life. You're trying to create a human being, right? But it's the fact that to do it pragmatically, you've got to create a number of embryos. Many of them will never be implanted, and either they're going to be destroyed or just kept in storage till they're no longer viable, right? And I see each embryo as a human person. And then when you're implanting those embryos, many times you have to implant multiple embryos because you're not ever certain if an embryo is going to take, which oftentimes leads to multiple pregnancies simultaneously, and that requires a reduction, right? Which is essentially aborting some of those embryos, right? So the practice surrounding in vitro fertilization is very much antithetical to a pro-life viewpoint, right? So we've got to tread very lightly and very thoughtfully when we start thinking about these emerging technologies, right? And there's things that we just take for granted, like in vitro fertilization, that really have profound pro-life implications.
Yeah.
And so someone can be very much pro-life and wind up unwittingly in a really messy situation if they pursue in vitro fertilization. And there are other options that people have, like adoption, right? That may be preferred as opposed to, pursuing something like in vitro fertilization.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of and like you said, I think approaching that with compassion, because it is a messy, emotional kind of conversation. So as somebody's maybe pursuing that, or you're having a conversation with your kids around it, or you're coming from a very quote unquote pro-life kind of position, how you have those conversations and how you listen and how you have a willingness to step into their world and their mess and maybe trauma and pain matters, because I think a lot of times where Christians have done ourselves a very big disservice is we really want to shoot all the facts out there, and sometimes we don't always get them actually too correct, and then we also don't approach with the love and compassion. You don't sit down and listen to a story and feel the heartache that somebody has gone through of an entire life of imagining it one way and then all the complexities of that. And so I think for the Christians that are having those conversations, we just have to do so prayerfully with the invitation of the Holy Spirit inside of that, and one of loving people with compassion. But I think that's a very real thing, though. As we look at science and try to understand it, we also have to be honest about those realities as well. That happen and things like that.
I couldn't have said it better, and I appreciate the point that you're making. Because, when somebody is thinking about pursuing in vitro fertilization, it's not cheap, right? It's oftentimes, in many respects, a last resort. And there's an enormous amount of pain and disappointment that's tied up in that decision. And for those people that are pursuing it, it feels like a source of hope, right? And so we want to always be very careful to respect that. But at the same time, we also need to be truthful about really what does this practice entail, and is this a cost that you're willing to inflict? In order to achieve your dreams, right?
Last question, just for those who are curious, because you kind of swim in this world a lot more. What are some technologies on the horizon that you think pose maybe some of your most excited about? You've talked about a few of those, I think, but that maybe pose some of the biggest ethical or theological dilemmas for believers, just to be thinking through, researching, praying through as we continue to move at this fast pace in society.
Yeah, I think, we've already talked about brain-computer interfaces and gene editing, and those are going to be the two big ones, at least with respect to technologies that impact us directly as human beings. Another one that I think is going to be rather insidious is anti-aging technology. Because, we do everything we can as human beings to delay the aging process. We try to eat, really well. We try to we exercise, we take supplements. We, have yearly, physicals. We do all these things to try to detect disease early, to take corrective action as soon as we can. Yeah. So we are obsessed with living as long as we can, right? And there's nothing, in my mind, wrong with that. And we are now on the cusp of seeing very real anti-aging technology coming down the path, right? It's not snake oil type stuff anymore. I've seen clinical studies where there are certain treatments that subjects in those studies have been given, and there are ways you can measure your biological age based on certain biomarkers. And the test subjects after that treatment regime were actually chronologically older than their biological age. In other words, the aging process was not only arrested, it was actually reversed.
Wow.
And so given how much we are obsessed with living as long as we can, there's going to be anti-aging technology that's going to be available to us probably in the very near future. And that has the potential to literally restructure the totality of society, to impact how we think of children and how children think of parents and grandparents. The implications of this are far-reaching, and it's going to be very easy, I think, for people to buy into different anti-aging procedures, because as I get older, There's things I want to do. I don't like thinking about my life, coming to an end on one hand. There are things I want to accomplish. There's things I want to see and experience. So I want to live as long as I possibly can, right? And so I think anti-aging technology could very well make transhumanists of us all in that respect. So that's something that I think in the near future is going to be another controversy that we're going to have to wrestle with as Christians. Because is it really wrong to try to live a little bit longer? And there are actually biomedical scientists who are arguing now that what we really should be focusing research effort on is actually anti-aging, because the number one factor that determines whether you're going to develop cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, the list goes on and on and on, is your age, right? Age correlates with the onset of many of these really expensive, life-ending diseases. And the thought is that if you can stop the aging process or reverse the aging process, that this is actually going to be a way to manage, medical costs, because people are not going to develop these diseases.
Gotcha, yeah.
But now people are going to be living longer. And so really, what is the point that we do this? But there's literally a change in how people are thinking about aging from a medical standpoint, from being an inevitability that you just manage to actually being a disease that you can treat or maybe even cure.
Wow.
And so this is going to be something that's going to be, it's easy to say, look, you shouldn't, amputate your limbs to get robotic limbs so you can be a better athlete.
Yeah.
That's easy to say. That seems to be a line we don't want to cross. But when it comes to anti-aging technology, who wouldn't want their beloved parents to live a little bit longer, right? And have more time with them, right? Who themselves wouldn't want to live longer.
Yeah. Real life Peter Pan stuff there, just never stuck in Neverland. I thought I was doing well when my in-body scan one time said I was like a year younger biologically than I actually am. And so I could be 10 years. That's crazy. But yeah, to your point, it sounds attractive. And I think when a lot of these things are marketed or sold to us, the pros list is huge, right? And so I think we're going to have to continue to be honest about what's the cons list about those types of things. And again, just approach it with so much wisdom and invite the Spirit into it, because we're not regressing in this area. We're just moving faster than ever. So. And
it's so easy when it comes to something like anti-aging to be selfish, right? It's okay for me to live longer, but maybe you shouldn't consider doing that, right?
Yeah.
Because of the implications, for society, for, cross-generational relationships.
Yeah. When I think of how that could affect justice issues and poverty and those who have and those who do not have, and okay, we could go down a whole rabbit hole, but we'll stop here. And I'm sure many people say this after they have a conversation. They could sit here and just talk about this stuff for hours, but we don't have that today. But I'm grateful, for this conversation and the questions that you answered, and just the work that you're doing for the kingdom to wrestle through all of these things. So people that are a little bit more finite like me, until I get that Neuralink and then I can be as smart as you, can understand these things. And so, yeah, thank you for your time today. It's humbling to have the conversation. And for your listeners, thank you for listening. We are grateful for you. If anytime you want to reach out to us, you can email us at podcast@cccoma.org. Also, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok at CCCOMA podcast. We will put reasons to believe. We'll tag them in this so you can go find them and all the resources on that. And we love to get voicemails from you, 402-885-9930. Until next time, we'll talk to you then.